a8. Rook takes a8. Queen g4. f6. Bishop d4. e5. Bishop takes c5. Queen takes c5. Queen e6 check. King h8. Knight h4. Knight f4. Queen f5. b4. g3. Knight e2 check. King g2. Knight d4. Queen e4. Rook c8. c3. b takes c3. b takes c3. Knight e6. Knight g6 check. King g8. Queen f5. King f7. Rook d1. Rook c7. Knight h8 check. e4. c5. Knight f3. d6. d4. c takes d4. Queen takes d4. a6. Bishop e2. Knight c6. Queen e3. g6. h3. Bishop g7. Short castle. Knight f6. c4. Short castle. Knight c3. Knight d7. b3. Knight c5. Bishop b2. f5. E takes f5. Bishop takes f5. Rook fd1. Rook c8. Rook ac1. Queen a5. Bishop a1. Rook ce8. Knight h4. Bishop c8. Knight f3. Bishop f5. Knight d5. Queen takes a2. Bishop takes g7. King takes g7. b4. Knight d7. b5. A takes b5. C takes b5. Knight ce5. Knight d4. e6. Knight f4. Knight c5. g4. Bishop e4. Rook takes c5. D takes c5. Queen takes e4. C takes d4. Queen takes e5 check. King g8. Rook takes d4. Queen b3. Bishop c4. Queen b1 check. a6. Knight f3. e6. d4. d5. Knight b d2. c5. D takes c5. Bishop takes c5. Bishop d3. Knight c6. c3. Knight f6. Queen e2. Short castle. Short castle. e5. E takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight b3. Bishop b6. Rook d1. Bishop e6. Knight g5. h6. Queen h5. Knight f6. Queen h4. Bishop takes b3. Bishop h7 check. Knight takes h7. Rook takes d8. Rook a takes d8. Knight e4. Rook d1 checkmate. Checkmate, black is victorious. d6. E takes f4. Queen takes f4. g3. Queen g4. Queen takes g4. H takes g4. Knight takes d6. Bishop e6. Rook a d1. b6. Rook fe1. Rook d8. Knight a b5. Knight takes b5. Knight takes b5. Rook d7. Bishop f1. a6. Knight a3. d4. Knight b1. Bishop b3. Rook d2. Bishop takes a4. Bishop takes a6. Rook h6. Rook de2. Rook d8. C takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Knight c3. Bishop b3. White timeout, black is victorious. Bishop e3. Queen e5. Bishop f4. Queen h5. Queen g3. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Knight f6. Bishop f3. Queen g6. Rook d2. Queen takes g3. Bishop takes g3. Bishop b4. Rook d3. Short castle. a3. Bishop e7. Rook a d1. Rook a d8. b4. Rook takes d3. Rook takes d3. Rook d8. Rook takes d8 check. Bishop takes d8. King f1. King f8. Bishop e5. Knight d7. Bishop c3. Bishop e7. King e2. King e8. King d3. f6. Bishop e2. e5. King c2. King f7. King b3. g6. Bishop d3. Bishop g1. Bishop h6. Queen d3. f6. Knight h2. Queen e7. Knight takes g4. Bishop takes g4. Bishop takes g4. H takes g4. Bishop e3. Long castle. Bishop takes h6. Rook takes h6. a4. Queen h7. Knight a2. Knight e7. Knight b4. f5. Rook he1. Rook f8. Queen c4. f4. G takes f4. Rook takes f4. Rook e3. King d8. Rook c3. Knight c8. Rook e1. Rook takes h4. Knight d3. Rook h3. Knight takes f4. E takes f4. Queen d4. Rook takes c3. Queen takes c3. g3. Queen f3. Queen h4. Rook h1. Queen g5. Rook h8 check. King e7. Queen g2. f3. d4. Short castle. Knight c6. d3. Bishop e7. Knight a3. Short castle. e3. e5. E takes d4. E takes d4. Rook e1. Bishop f5. Knight h4. Bishop g4. Bishop f3. Bishop takes f3. Queen takes f3. Rook e8. Knight f5. Bishop takes a3. Rook takes e8 check. Queen takes e8. B takes a3. Queen e1 check. King g2. Queen c3. Rook b1. Knight e5. Queen takes b7. Rook e8. Bishop f4. Knight takes d3. Bishop g5. Knight e1 check. King h1. Queen d3. Knight e7 check. Rook takes e7. White resigned, black is victorious. f4. Queen takes f4. Queen f3. Queen d6. Rook e3. Bishop g5. Rook e2. Bishop f4. Knight f1. g5. Knight d2. Bishop takes d2. Rook takes d2. Rook e8. Rook f2. f6. Rook e2. Rook takes e2 check. Queen takes e2. King f7. a4. Queen e6. Queen f3. Queen e4. King f2. Queen takes f3 check. King takes f3. g6. King e3. f5. King f3. King e6. King e3. King d6. King d3. c5. b3. King c6. King e3. f4 check. King d3. King b6. b4. C takes d4. C takes d4. e4. c5. Knight f3. e6. d4. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. a6. g3. Knight f6. Bishop g2. d5. Knight b3. D takes e4. Queen takes d8 check. King takes d8. Knight c3. Bishop d7. Bishop g5. Bishop e7. Bishop takes f6. Bishop takes f6. Knight takes e4. Bishop c6. Long castle check. King c7. Knight a5. Bishop d5. c4. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Knight c6. Knight takes c6. B takes c6. King c2. Rook a b8. b3. c5. Rook d3. Bishop d4. f4. f5. Bishop f3. Rook h e8. Rook e1. a5. Rook d2. a4. Rook d e2. Rook b6. g4. A takes b3 check. A takes b3. F takes g4. Bishop takes g4. Rook a8. Rook takes e6. Rook a2 check. King d3. Rook takes b3 check. King e4. Rook takes h2. King d5. Rook h6. Rook takes h6. G takes h6. Rook e7 check. King b6. Rook takes h7. Rook g3. Rook takes h6 check. King a5. Rook g6. King b4. Bishop f5. Rook g1. Rook takes g1. Bishop takes g1. Bishop e6. Bishop d4. f5. King c3. King d6. Queen g3. Queen takes d4. Knight d2. Queen takes b2. King e2. Queen e5. Queen e3. Knight d4 check. King d3. Knight ec6. Rook a f1. b6. Knight c4. Bishop a6. King d2. Rook a d8. Knight takes e5. Knight f5 check. Knight d3. Knight takes e3. King takes e3. Bishop takes d3. C takes d3. Knight d4. Bishop d1. h5. Rook takes f8. King takes f8. Rook f1 check. King g7. Rook f2. c5. g3. King g6. a4. a6. Rook f1. Rook d6. Rook f8. b5. A takes b5. A takes b5. Rook c8. Knight e6. Rook b8. b4. Rook b5. King f6. e4. d5. E takes d5. Knight f6. c4. e6. D takes e6. Bishop takes e6. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop e2. Bishop c5. Short castle. Queen d7. d3. Long castle. a3. Knight d4. Knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4. Knight c3. h5. Knight b5. Knight g4. Bishop f4. a6. Knight takes c7. g5. Knight takes e6. G takes f4. Knight takes d8. Queen takes d8. Bishop f3. Queen h4. Bishop takes g4 check. H takes g4. h3. G takes h3. Queen f3. H takes g2. Queen takes g2. f3. White resigned, black is victorious. h3. f2 check. King takes f2. Bishop takes d1. Knight c3. Bishop c2. Knight b5. Bishop c5. Knight takes c7 check. King e7. Knight a6. Knight e4 check. Bishop takes e4. Bishop takes e4. Knight takes c5. Bishop takes b7. b3. Rook h d8. King e2. Bishop g2. h4. Bishop h3. Bishop b2. Bishop g4 check. King e1. Rook b c8. Bishop d4. Rook c6. b4. Rook d c8. King d2. a5. a3. f6. King c3. Rook b8. b5. Rook d6. Knight a6. Rook takes a6. B takes a6. a4. a7. Rook b3 check. King d2. Bishop f3. Rook f1. Bishop a8. Rook f5. King d6. Rook a5. King e6. Rook takes a4. King f5. Rook b4. Rook takes a3. Rook b8. Bishop e4. Rook e8. g5. Rook f8. King g4. Rook takes f6. King takes g3. H takes g5. Rook d3 check. King c1. Rook a3. King b2. Black resigned, white is victorious. Rook e8. Rook takes e8 check. Rook takes e8. Knight d4. Knight d6. e5. Bishop takes g2. King takes g2. Knight c4. Rook e2. Rook takes e5. Rook takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight b5. c5. Knight takes a7. King f7. Knight b5. King e6. Knight a3. King d5. King f2. King e4. Knight b5. King d3. h4. King c4. Knight c7. King takes c3. Knight d5 check. King b2. Knight takes b6. King takes a2. King e3. King b3. King e4. Knight g4. King f4. Knight f2. King e5. c4. King f6. c3. Knight d7. Knight e4 check. King e5. c2. King takes e4. c1 promotes to queen. Knight e5. Queen g1. King d5. Queen takes g3. King e6. Queen takes h4. Bishop takes f3 check. King takes f3. g5. Bishop g3. Queen h5 check. King f2. g4. Bishop d3. f5. Rook e1. Bishop d6. Bishop takes d6. C takes d6. King g1. Knight gf6. Rook f1. King b8. Rook takes f5. Queen h6. Queen c1. Queen g7. Queen f4. h5. Rook f1. g3. Rook takes f6. G takes h2 check. King takes h2. Knight takes f6. Queen takes f6. Queen takes f6. Rook takes f6. Rook h f8. Rook takes f8. Rook takes f8. Knight e4. Rook d8. Knight f6. a6. Knight takes h5. b5. g4. King c7. g5. Rook h8. e4. Knight c6. Knight f3. d5. E takes d5. Queen takes d5. Knight c3. Queen h5. Bishop e2. Bishop g4. h3. Knight f6. King f1. Long castle. King g1. Bishop takes f3. Bishop takes f3. Queen h4. Bishop takes c6. B takes c6. Queen e2. Queen b4. a3. Queen b6. d3. Knight d5. Knight e4. e6. Knight g5. Rook d7. c4. Knight f6. b4. Queen d4. Bishop b2. Queen takes d3. Queen takes d3. Rook takes d3. Knight takes f7. Rook g8. Knight e5. Rook d2. Rook b1. Knight e4. f3. Knight g3. Knight takes c6. Knight takes h1. King takes h1. a6. c5. g5. Bishop c3. Rook d3. Rook c1. h5. Knight e5. Rook d5. a4. Bishop g7. Rook e1. Rook f8. g4. H takes g4. H takes g4. Bishop takes e5. Bishop takes e5. Rook takes f3. e4. Knight c6. d4. e5. D takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight c3. Bishop b4. Queen d4. Queen e7. Bishop d2. Knight f6. Knight f3. Knight c6. Queen e3. Bishop takes c3. Bishop takes c3. Queen takes e4. Queen takes e4 check. Knight takes e4. Bishop takes g7. Rook g8. Bishop h6. d5. Bishop e3. Bishop e6. Long castle. Long castle. Bishop b5. a6. Bishop takes c6. B takes c6. Knight d4. Rook takes g2. f3. Knight d6. Knight takes c6. Rook e8. Bishop f4. Bishop f5. Knight d4. Bishop g6. Rook hg1. Rook takes g1. Rook takes g1. Knight f5. Knight takes f5. Bishop takes f5. Rook g5. Bishop g6. Rook takes d5. Rook e2. Rook d2. Rook e6. b3. Rook f6. Rook d4. Rook c6. c4. Rook e6. King b2. Rook e2 check. Rook d2. Rook e1. Bishop g3. Rook e3. f4. Bishop f5. King a3. Rook e6. King b4. Rook b6 check. King c5. King b7. Rook d5. Rook c6 check. King d4. Bishop e6. Knight b d7. Knight c3. a6. Bishop e2. Knight b6. h3. Bishop h5. d3. Knight f takes d5. Knight takes d5. Knight takes d5. c4. Knight b6. Bishop g5. Queen d7. a4. e6. Queen b3. a5. Short castle. Bishop b4. d4. Short castle. Rook f d1. c6. Knight e5. Bishop takes e2. Knight takes d7. Bishop takes d1. Queen g3. Knight takes d7. Bishop h6. g6. Bishop takes f8. Rook takes f8. Rook takes d1. Rook d8. Queen c7. Queen b7. Queen c4. Knight d5. Queen e4. Rook he8. Rook takes h7. Knight f8. Bishop h4. Knight takes h7. Queen takes h7. Rook d7. Bishop g3. Rook f7. Queen e4. c5. f5. Rook takes f5. Bishop takes d6 check. King a8. Rook f3. Rook takes f3. Queen takes f3. Queen c6. Knight takes b6 check. A takes b6. Bishop e5. White resigned, black is victorious. Knight takes g5. Queen d6. Knight e6 check. King h8. Bishop d3. Rook takes g4 check. King h1. Rook a g8. Queen e3. Knight g5. Bishop e2. Knight takes e6. Bishop takes g4. Knight takes g4. Queen e4. Knight f4. Rook e2. Queen h6. Rook e f2. Knight takes f2 check. Rook takes f2. Queen f6. Rook f1. Knight h3. Queen e2. Queen g7. Queen e3. Queen g2 checkmate. Checkmate, black is victorious. b6. Short castle. Bishop b7. Knight b5. C takes d4. Knight b takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Bishop c5. Rook f d1. d5. Bishop f3. Bishop takes d4. Rook takes d4. D takes c4. Queen takes c4. Bishop takes f3. G takes f3. Queen takes f3. Rook a d1. Rook a c8. Queen a4. Rook c5. h4. Rook fc8. Rook f4. Queen h3. Queen takes a7. Rook c1. Queen takes f7 check. King h8. Rook d4. Rook takes d1 check. Rook takes d1. Queen g4 check. White resigned, black is victorious. Rook a5. Queen g7. Rook e8. Knight takes e6. F takes e6. Queen takes e7. Rook takes e7. Bishop e4. Knight e5. b4. A takes b3. A takes b3. Knight d7. f4. Rook a2. f5. e5. b4. Knight f6. Bishop d5. Rook g7. g3. Knight g4. Bishop takes a2. Black resigned, white is victorious. Knight d7. a3. Knight takes c2. Knight takes c2. Bishop takes b2. Rook b1. Bishop takes c2. Queen takes c2. Bishop takes a3. Rook takes b7. Bishop c5. Queen f5. g6. Queen f4. Bishop takes e3. F takes e3. f5. g4. Knight c5. G takes f5. Rook e4. Queen h6. Rook h4. Queen takes h4. Queen takes h4. Rook takes c7. Rook f8. F takes g6. Queen g5 check. King h1. Rook takes f1 check. Bishop takes f1. H takes g6. Rook c8 check. King g7. Rook c6. Knight e4. Bishop g2. Knight f2 check. King g1. Queen takes e3. King f1. Knight d3. White resigned, black is victorious. e4. c5. c3. Knight f6. e5. Knight d5. d4. C takes d4. Queen takes d4. e6. Knight f3. Knight c6. Queen g4. f5. Queen g3. g6. Knight bd2. Bishop g7. Knight c4. Short castle. a4. f4. Queen g4. Queen c7. h4. Knight takes e5. Knight f takes e5. Bishop takes e5. h5. d6. H takes g6. H takes g6. Knight takes e5. D takes e5. Bishop d3. Knight f6. Queen g5. Queen g7. Rook h6. Knight h7. Queen h4. Rook f6. Rook takes h7. Queen takes h7. Queen takes f6. Queen h1 check. Bishop f1. b6. Queen takes e5. Bishop a6. Queen takes e6 check. King h7. c4. Rook c8. Rook a3. Queen takes f1 check. King takes f1. Bishop takes c4 check. Queen takes c4. Rook takes c4. Bishop d2. Black resigned, white is victorious. King f2. Rook d2 check. King g3. Rook g2 check. King h3. King f4. Knight ce2. h5. d3. e5. f4. f6. Knight f3. Knight c6. F takes e5. F takes e5. Bishop g5. Knight f6. h4. Bishop g4. Queen d2. Queen d7. c3. Long castle. c4. Bishop b4. Knight c3. D takes c3. B takes c3. Bishop c5. Bishop e2. Rook d f8. Long castle. Knight d8. Knight takes e5. Queen a4. Bishop takes f6. G takes f6. Knight takes g4. H takes g4. Bishop takes g4 check. King b8. King b1. f5. Bishop takes f5. Rook f6. King a1. Rook b6. Rook b1. Rook h6. d4. Bishop e7. c5. Rook takes b1 check. Rook takes b1. Rook takes h4. e5. a6. g3. Rook h8. Bishop e4. Queen d7. c6. Queen g4. Queen d3. b6. Queen takes a6. Queen takes e4. Rook takes b6 check. C takes b6. Queen takes b6 check. King c8. Queen a6 check. e5, f4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop c5, c3, d6, d4, e takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b4 check, knight c3, bishop g4, d5, knight ce7, queen a4 check, c6, queen takes b4, d takes c6, knight takes c6, knight f3, e5, bishop e2, e4, knight g1, bishop c5, d3, queen f6, bishop e3, bishop takes e3, f takes e3, queen takes b2, knight d2, e takes d3, c takes d3, knight f6, knight gf3, knight g4, knight c4, queen c3 check, knight fd2, b5, rook c1, queen f6, bishop takes g4, b takes c4, bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c4, short castle, queen f3, queen d6, short castle, knight e5, queen e4, knight takes c4, knight takes c4, queen e6, queen takes e6, f takes e6, rook takes f8 check, rook takes f8, e4, g5, g3, king g7, king g2, g4, king g1, h5, king g2, rook f3, knight e5, rook f8, knight c4, rook d8, knight b2, rook c8, king f1, rook c2, knight c4, rook takes a2, d4, rook takes h2, bishop takes d5, c takes d5, king f3, rook takes h3, rook h1, rook takes h1, rook takes h1, king e7, f takes g5, f takes g5, rook h5, bishop takes g3, king takes g3, rook g8, king f3, b5, king e3, a5, king d3, a4, b3, a takes b3, a takes b3, rook g7, c4, b takes c4 check, b takes c4, d takes c4 check, d4, e5, knight f3, e4, knight fd2, e3, f takes e3, queen h4 check, g3, bishop e7, knight f3, queen h5, bishop g2, d5, knight bd2, knight f6, c4, c6, c takes d5, c takes d5, queen a4 check, knight c6, knight e5, short castle, knight takes c6, b takes c6, knight f3, c5, d takes c5, bishop takes c5, short castle, rook e8, knight d4, bishop h3, bishop d2, bishop takes g2, king takes g2, knight g4, h3, knight takes e3 check, bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, rook f2, rook a e8, rook a f1, bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, rook takes e2, Queen takes a7. h6. Rook takes e2. Rook takes e2 check. Rook f2. Queen e5. Rook takes e2. Queen takes e2 check. Queen f2. Queen e4 check. King h2. d4. b4. d3. b5. Queen c4. b6. Queen c2. Queen takes c2. d takes c2. b7. c1 promotes to queen. b8 promotes to queen check. King h7. Queen b3. King g8. Queen f3. Queen b2 check. Queen g2. C takes d5. C takes d5. Knight b5. Bishop b4 check. Bishop c3. Bishop takes c3 check. Knight b takes c3. e4. Bishop c2. Rook e8. Knight f4. Knight f8. Short castle. Bishop g4. Queen d2. Rook c8. Rook ac1. Knight g6. Knight takes g6. H takes g6. b4. Queen d6. Bishop b3. Bishop e6. h3. Queen takes b4. Knight takes e4. Queen e7. Knight takes f6 check. Queen takes f6. Queen b4. b6. Queen b5. Queen g5. Rook takes c8. Rook takes c8. King h2. Queen e7. King h1. Queen d6. Queen e2. g5. Queen d2. g4. H takes g4. Bishop takes g4. Rook c1. Rook d8. Queen c3. Queen h6 check. King g1. Rook d6. Queen c7. a5. Queen b8 check. King h7. Bishop c2 check. f5. Bishop d3. Rook g6. Rook c8. Rook g5. Rook h8 check. King g6. Queen d6 check. King f7. Rook takes h6. G takes h6. Queen takes d5 check. King g7. Queen e5 check. King h7. Queen e7 check. Rook g7. Queen e5. Rook g5. d5. Bishop h3. g3. Bishop g4. e5. Knight f3. Knight c6. Bishop b5. a6. Bishop a4. Knight f6. Short castle. Bishop e7. Rook e1. b5. Bishop b3. Short castle. d6. D takes e5. Knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. D takes e5. Queen e2. Bishop c5. Bishop e3. Bishop d4. Bishop takes d4. Queen takes d4. Rook d1. Bishop g4. Rook takes d4. Bishop takes e2. Rook takes b4. c5. Rook b7. c4. Bishop a2. Knight takes e4. f3. Knight c5. Rook c7. Knight e6. Rook e7. e4. King f2. E takes f3. G takes f3. Bishop d1. Knight a3. Rook a d8. Bishop takes c4. Bishop takes c2. a5. Bishop d3. Rook a7. Knight c5. King g3. Bishop takes c4. Knight takes c4. Rook d4. Rook c1. h5.